So now that we've completed the validation, we can go down and we can check if the errors array is empty, as we've already been doing. So if not empty array, that means we display the errors, otherwise we continue with editing the album. So we can use the for each here, and we can say for each errors as error, and we can go ahead and just echo out the error and a line break. Okay, so now inside else, this means we can edit album. So edit will just echo out for now, and if we refresh the page, we'll cancel that and just click on there. If we click edit, you can see that we just get this edit up, and that means that we have no errors, and we can go ahead and continue with processing this function, or calling this function to edit the album. So we obviously need to actually create this function first, so let's go down to edit album. Now this function takes in an album ID, an album name, and an album description. The database will update the album name and the album description in the table albums where the album ID is equal to the one that you've specified, and obviously this album ID is present here. So it's a pretty easy job to do this function. It's just a simple query that we're going to perform, and we're just going to edit, the album name essentially. So let's go ahead, and the first thing we want to do in here is create some kind of sanitization, so we don't actually end up performing an SQL injection. So the first thing I'm going to do is reset album ID, and that's going to be equal to album ID. However, we're going to cast that to an int to ensure that it's always an integer, which it should be. I'm also going to then say album name is equal to MySQL real escape string, and inside of here put the album name. Okay, I can go ahead and copy and paste that now and just change these two to description. So we sanitize the name and the description. Then we can go ahead and perform the query to actually update the album name and description. So we say MySQL query, and the query is as follows. So we need to say update albums set album, or set name, I think we've just called the field. So set the name is equal to album name, and then a comma, and description equal to album description, where, this is extremely important, album ID is equal to album ID, and this is also important, user ID is equal to, and then obviously we just say concatenate on the session that we have, which is user ID. So let me just run over this query in case you're a bit worried about what it does and how it works. We're updating the albums table, we're setting the name inside of here to album name, so the name field to album name, the one that we've specified to edit, the description to the album description, again the one we've specified to edit, and this is where the album ID is equal to album ID. Remember, we pass this into the function, and we pass this when we call it here, and that's the album ID that we take from this variable here. This variable here, album ID. We then also, we need to, one of the conditions is where the user ID is equal to the current session, because if it wasn't, then there'd be potential to update the album name where the album name or description where the user ID was anyone. So now that this query is complete, that's all we need to do. We can go ahead and actually call the function now. So in edit album, let's go down to where we would call the function here, and what we'd need to do is we would just need to call edit album. So let's go ahead and say edit album. We need to specify or pass 3 parameters. The first parameter being the album ID, which we take from the URL using get. So let's go down and say album ID. We then need to pass album name, which the user has typed into the album name field, and the same with album description. What we then want to do is relocate the user. So we want to relocate them somewhere, which is albums.php. We're going to just take them back to the albums page so they can immediately see their changes, and then we're just going to exit the script. Not really any need to, but good to get into the habit of doing it after headers. Okay, so let's go and test if this has worked. I might have made a mistake somewhere. Let's go back to the albums page actually. So let's say we want to update holiday and we want to change the name to Fun in the Sun. So if we click on edit, we want to change the name of this to Fun in the Sun, and we want to add an exclamation mark at the end of photos. When we click edit, the edit album function is called after we validated our data. We pass the album ID, which is here, and we update the name and the description next to where the album ID is equal to 56. So we click edit, we're taken back, and you can see that the album name has changed to Fun in the Sun, and the exclamation mark has been added onto the end of the description. Okay, so now what we also need to bear in mind is that we don't want this page here to be accessed by anyone else other than ourselves. So we need a check to be performed to check if the album ID belongs to us. So this album ID of 56 corresponds to our username in the table. So we need to up here first of all check if the get var is set, and then we need to check if the album belongs to us. So with this we use the album check function and we read in an album ID. So let's go ahead and create the if statement, and then we'll start to develop the function. So the first thing is check if the if or if the get variable is set. So if, and then a block. So if is set $_get album ID, or rather if not is set, or album check album ID, and that's where I think we need to, oh no, we can just pop in get album ID, I guess. So $_get album ID, and if this function is equal to false, that means that the album does not belong to us, so we relocate the user. So we locate them back to albums.php, and then we exit, which is extremely important because then the rest of the page will be viewable if for some reason headers were modified to not be set in a browser. So this album check function needs to be complete. Let's just go ahead and test this first of all. If we press enter, we have this page up. If I was to get rid of these numbers here and press enter, you can see that we're not located back. So let's check why that might be. Not is set. Okay, so what this means is if if this exists here but it doesn't have a number, it still is set. So we also need to add a check if empty $_get album ID. Okay, so we could really get rid of is set and just leave empty, but we'll leave both in for the sake of it. So let's press enter, we're relocated back to albums.php, and as well, if the album didn't belong to us, we would then be redirected as well. But we need to create this function enabled to make the check. So let's go over to album.func.php and create this function. So it's relatively simple. The concept is basically just returning a value based on a query. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we first need to sanitize album ID. So we're going to cast album ID to an int or an integer. We then need to perform a query, and that query is going to be, okay, so the first thing we want to do is actually select the count of the albums from albums where the album is equal to a specific album ID, which we've specified here, and where our user ID is equal to the session. So let's go ahead and just do this. So select count, and we want to count the album ID from albums. So we're selecting the count of the of the albums that are returned from this query, where the album ID is equal to album ID and user ID is equal to, we can just concatenate the session onto the end of here. So it's checking, it's essentially like a login script. We're checking where the album ID is what we specified, and this matches a user ID that we're currently logged in with as well. Okay, so we can also from here just take a result. So we want to say return, and we're again using an inline or simplified if statement, and this is MySQL result query and first row. And now if that is equal to 1, we return true, otherwise we return false. Now let's explain this a bit better. Count is going to return a number. If that number is equal to 1, it means that our album ID and user ID correspond in the database, therefore it belongs to us. So we return the function as true, and the album does belong to us. If this is equal to 0, that means that we return false because the album doesn't belong to us. So now we can actually make use of this album check function, and we can go and just test this out, I guess. So let's go edit. Let's just change this to 12. Now this doesn't exist in the database, but if it did, it wouldn't match our user ID. So the function's checking this album ID as 12 against our user ID. So you can see that here we've got, let's browse the albums folder, we've got album ID. Now 12 doesn't exist, but if it did and the user ID next to it was 5, this wouldn't match our query, or this wouldn't match what we've checked for. So if I press enter, we're automatically relocated back to albums. Now the reason I talked about importance of security, because this is the kind of thing that some people don't take into account, that people can actually modify the URL extremely easily and go ahead and they could actually edit other people's albums. So it's extremely important that you think about security issues like this and actually attempt to protect against them. Okay, so now that we've actually edited the album, we need to now find a way to delete the album. So in the next part of the tutorial, we're going to look at how we can actually delete albums. And it's an extremely similar method. Again, like I've pointed out, this passes the album ID. We're going to run a few checks and make sure the album belongs to us again. And then we can just call the function inside of our albums, or album.func.php, and that query, or sorry, that function is delete album. So we have one more function to create inside of this function definition file.